Our next guest is retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who mostly operated behind the scenes. That is until the morning of July 25th, 2019, when Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman, who was working as a Russia military expert at the National Security Council at the time, was listening in on a phone call between then President Donald Trump and Ukraine's newly elected President Volodymyr Zelensky. As history notes, that was the infamous call that spurred the first impeachment process against then President Trump and changed Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's life forever. His story and never before shared details are all covered in his new book, Here, Right Matters, An American Story. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, kind enough to join us tonight. Thank you so much for coming on the show tonight, sir.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start from the beginning of that call, right? So as it's been stated, then President Trump was congratulating the new president of Ukraine, Zelensky. The relationship at that point was a bit tense because the Trump administration at that time had been withholding finances from Ukraine. So give us a sense of the tone at the beginning of the call, and that at what point you decide something's not quite right here.
Sure. So it was set up as a congratulatory call, similar to the one I set up for him when Zelensky was elected president back in the April timeframe. But immediately, as the president joined the line, you could tell by his tone that this was not going to be a typical congratulatory call. The president was, as he would describe, monotone, low energy, and really a reluctant participant in the call. And only, so to me, that set off alarm bells. But really, the call went from bad to worse progressively, and only at the point where Zelensky perked up and said, hey, we want to buy additional weapons. And Donald Trump responded with, yes, but I'd like you to do us a favor, though. That's when the call went completely off, not just off script, but off of anything that, I guess, that I had ever heard of before.
Kind of off the rails, so to speak.
Completely off the rails.
And that's the point when he starts talking about potentially investigating the Bidens?
That's exactly right.
And so what was he saying at that moment?
So the president had started by touting how much the United States does for Ukraine, which is true. He also cast a shadow over the kind of support that the European Union and European allies were offering. And he was just setting the conditions for the big ask, which was, if you want us to continue to provide, if you want these javelins, if you want these weapons, if you want continued U.S. support, if you want your White House visit, you have to do this investigation. And
how are you responding? That you're cringing, you're aghast?
So my immediate reaction was the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. In the preceding months, the many preceding months, you could see this enterprise unfold. Ambassador Yovanovitch was fired based on this rumor spread by Rudolph Giuliani, the president's personal counsel, and there were some stories that were circulating by John Solomon in The Hill. Ultimately, Don Jr., the president's son, got involved, and that's what really got Ambassador Yovanovitch canned. But none of this really necessarily added up to the president. This could have been cronies looking to ingratiate themselves with the president. Giuliani, Sondland, all these other characters were emerging. Mick Mulvaney, the president's chief of staff, but not until that phone call was it clear that the president was the driving force. And of course, as soon as having put all the pieces together, I knew what my immediate reaction needed to be, which was to report this, to try to see if we really get our relationship back on track, and to not let the president of the United States subvert the very foundations of our democracy, a free and fair election. And that's what I did. That's why I reported the phone call.
And in fact, you write in your book, I knew what I had to do. I'd known from the moment I heard the president say what he said, regardless of any impact on the president, the domestic and foreign policy consequences, or personal costs. I had no choice but to report what I'd heard. Did you have any idea at that time just what the personal cost was going to be?
Well, I certainly had the idea of a clear-eyed view of the gravity of the moment. When I went into my twin brother's office en route to talk to the senior legal official, the person that I was hoping was going to speak to the president and get him to reverse course, I walked into Eugene's office and I said, close the door, had a little dramatic pause, make sure I had his attention. I told him, Eugene, if what I'm about to tell you ever becomes public, the president will be impeached. understanding the gravity of the situation, I also had some inkling of the potential consequences, but I thought those would be rather limited, maybe to my tenure at the NSC. I didn't really necessarily kind of identify that this was going to be a complete upheaval, because this is all private, behind closed doors, through official channels, and I really didn't have any idea that this was going to become public.
And as you stated, that's what ended up happening. You then end up being called as a witness in the House impeachment proceedings. Many of the Republicans were very critical of you, to say the least, basically saying that you were coming after then President Trump. At one point, you said that you had considered moving your family onto a military base for protection. How did you make it through that time, and how difficult was it?
It was very difficult. It was partially extremely difficult because the White House, my house, the house I was working on a daily basis, was attacking me. Those attack points that you heard coming out of Congress, that you heard coming out of Laura Ingraham, that you had coming out of Tucker Carlson, all these, they were on the same script, and it's because the White House had sent out attack points. They slipped up and sent it to the wrong individuals, and it leaked to the press. So that made things very challenging from a work environment. I still thought I could get things done, but at home, I also had to deal with letters coming to the home, threatening emails and things of that nature, which maybe I probably was a little bit cavalier based on my training, spending time in combat zones in Moscow, where it was a very kind of beleaguered environment. I tended to cast those aside and think laser focused on what the mission was, which is basically do the best I can to faithfully execute my oath, provide testimony. My wife, on the other hand, had to deal with those real threats and the fact that we had a young daughter at home, and it was a challenge. And that was just the beginning of the story. Obviously, this ended up ending my career, and had to rebuild and start from scratch.
And you talk about your training. Obviously, you served 21 years in the Army, survived an IED attack in Iraq, went on to get a Purple Heart as a result of that. You talk throughout the book about your devotion to the Constitution and how you knew immediately that it was your duty to report what you heard on that call. Even in contrast to your own father giving you advice, right, that you needed to support the president. Any doubts in your mind at all that you did the right thing, or do you question it at all even now?
I don't question it. I think one of the lessons I guess I tried to communicate through the book is this notion that sometimes you just have to take your own counsel. You're maybe the only person. Just like in that moment, I was responsible for my portfolio. I was really the person responsible for making the kind of complaint that I did. You have to take your own counsel. Your parents, your spouse might want you to take something of a more safer road, something that doesn't burn bridges with both the chief executive and maybe the service. But I knew what the right thing to do was. I knew what I could live with and what I couldn't live with. I knew that I wanted to make sure I could look my daughter in the eye and not have to equivocate, not have to whitewash, the way my actions, like so many other people have done. And I went with what I thought was right.
In so many ways, you kind of encapsulate the American dream. You immigrated to this country from Ukraine with your dad and brothers in 1979, went to college, served in the Army, go on to serve at the highest levels of the National Security Council. You're obviously a Ukrainian American, but your allegiance is with America. What would you say to those who are immigrants, who are talking about the ideals of the American dream?
This is the one of the many threads that unite all Americans, is that all of us are immigrants, whether it's our generation or previous generation. Very few of us could claim original native roots. And I think what I tried to do with this story about my immigrant background is to kind of revive this view that we are all immigrants. We all came here with the same hopes and aspirations of the hopes of prosperity in the United States. And I think that was a formative experience in me and developing me, defining me as a person, recognizing that, frankly, other places in the world have a much harder go of it than the United States. We have it quite good in spite of our shortcomings, and we need to not just preserve what we have, but we need to continue to make steps forward, continue to form that more perfect union. And I think that my military experience, the way my father raised me, all of these experiences that I write about in the book come together in my actions in this pivotal moment and in the aftermath.
Retired Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman is the author of the new book, Here, Right Matters, an American Story, available now. We thank you so much for your time. Appreciate you joining us in studio.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.